when the crown finds you in hiding. Have you ever tried to disappear into the background, only to discover that God was placing you center stage? Have you ever lived your life under the surface, not because you lacked potential, but because the world around you made hiding feel like survival? Esther didn't begin her story with influence, power, or even choice. She began it with loss, with exile, with silence. She was a Jewish girl living in Susa, the glittering capital of Persia. But don't let the palace walls and royal scrolls fool you. Esther's story began in obscurity. She was an orphan. Her mother and father had died, their names swallowed by a history that had no use for the forgotten. And so she was raised by her older cousin Mordecai, a man who carried his own grief and identity with restraint, wise, perceptive, loyal to his people but careful with his place. They lived as exiles, descendants of those who had been taken from Jerusalem when Babylon conquered it. Now Persia ruled the world, and Jews were scattered across its cities like ashes from a fire long extinguished. Esther had grown up in that world, a world where it was safer to be silent about who you were, a world where beauty could get you noticed, but belonging could still cost you everything. She had learned how to move quietly, how to listen more than speak, how to obey without drawing attention. But what no one saw, not even Esther herself, was that God was building strategy into her silence. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. It meant myrtle, a plant that releases its fragrance when crushed. But to the world around her, she was simply Esther, a Persian name, a new identity, one that meant star. And one day, a door opened that neither she nor Mordecai could have planned for. When a kingdom searches for a queen, the king of Persia at that time was Xerxes, a man of vast wealth, brutal pride, and emotional unpredictability. He had thrown a banquet lasting 180 days. That's not a metaphor. He literally hosted a half-year celebration to flaunt his power. Gold goblets, marble pillars, purple linens, the excess was unmatched. But the real unraveling began when he summoned Queen Vashti to appear before the guests. He wanted to showcase her beauty, not as a person but as a possession. She refused. It was a moment of defiance, a decision that carried consequences not just for Vashti, but for the entire empire. Xerxes, humiliated and enraged, consulted his advisors. Their verdict was swift: remove her crown, make an example of her. And so Vashti was banished. But kings who rule with pride often wake with regret. As time passed, Xerxes missed her, but the law had already been passed. So his officials suggested something new, something disturbing cloaked in royal glamour. Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins. Let the king appoint commissioners, and let beauty treatments be given. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2 verses 2-4. It sounded like an opportunity, but it was not a choice. This was not a royal invitation. It was a decree. A forced roundup of the most beautiful women from every province. They would be taken one by one into the palace harem, prepared, perfumed, trained, and after one night with the king, either dismissed or crowned. Esther was among them. We don't know how she reacted. We don't know if she wept, protested, or quietly submitted. But what we do know is this: she obeyed Mordecai's command not to reveal her identity, her people, her past, her God hidden. This is where the hand of God begins to press in, because even in exile, even under foreign rule, even in a system soaked in exploitation and ego, God was at work behind the curtain. Esther found favor with Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the women. He gave her special attention, the best place in the harem, the best food, and the best maids. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand. She simply listened, obeyed, watched, and waited. And when her turn came to go before the king, She didn't ask for anything extra. No ornaments, no extravagant demands. She simply took what Haggai recommended. And the moment Xerxes saw her, the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2 verse 17. Just like that, a Jewish orphan girl, raised in exile, trained in silence, disguised in beauty, became queen of the most powerful empire in the world. Not through ambition, not through seduction, but through providence. When the crown doesn't feel like victory, it's easy to think this was Esther's breakthrough, her promotion, her moment of glory. But crowns don't always feel like triumph. Sometimes they feel like tension. Esther was still hiding her identity, still navigating court politics, still alone in a palace that didn't know her name, not really. And Mordecai still watched from the gate, still checking on her, still caring, still unsure what this all meant. But one day he overheard a plot. Two of the king's officials were planning to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai told Esther. Esther told the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The men were investigated, hanged, and the report was written in the royal record. And then, silence. No reward. No recognition. No sign that anything had changed. But again, the hand of God was writing a story behind the scenes. Not with fire from heaven, not with parted seas, but with delayed justice, a hidden queen, and a scribe recording the moment. The lesson hidden in her silence. Esther didn't rise to power by fighting. She didn't break down palace doors or demand to be seen. She was faithful. In silence. In hiding. In submission. She didn't rush what God was arranging. She didn't cling to identity as a weapon. She let favor do what force never could. And maybe that's where you find yourself now. Maybe you're not at the center of your calling yet. Maybe you feel hidden, overlooked, disqualified by your background, or too quiet for the room you're in. But what if this quiet season is not a delay, but a positioning? What if God is placing you inside the very halls where decisions are made? Not so you can rise for your own sake, but so you'll be ready when His people need your voice? Esther didn't ask for the crown, but she wore it, and God would soon ask her to risk it. So if you feel hidden, silent, or small, don't dismiss the season. God still moves through those who obey before they understand. Share this with someone who feels like their purpose is tucked away behind glass ceilings or invisible battles. And if you've ever trusted God in a season where nothing made sense, write this below. I will be faithful even in hiding. God is placing me where I need to be. The silence between God's moves. What do you do when you are where God placed you, but He's not saying anything? When you obeyed, you showed up, you took the position, and still, no voice, no sign, no miracle, just the still weight of waiting. Esther was queen now, crowned, elevated, hidden. But for 5 long years, nothing happened. No visions, no assignments, no dreams in the night, no Mordecai rushing to send a secret message, just silence. And it's in this part of the story, this in-between space, that most people fall away. Because we think God moves from one dramatic scene to another, from the decree to the miracle, from the prayer to the breakthrough, from the pain to the promise. But Scripture reminds us, God works in silence just as much as He works in signs. This part of Esther's life didn't make headlines. There was no enemy at the gate, no fire to extinguish, no crisis that required her courage. But what God was forming in her was no less holy. A queen with no mandate. Imagine being Esther. You're in a palace surrounded by protocol, pressure, and politics. Your beauty got you through the door, but it won't sustain your influence. Your people don't know what power you really have. Your king doesn't know who you really are. And even you, some days, wonder what God is doing with your life. You wake up surrounded by luxury but burdened by loneliness. You sit at royal banquets but ache for something real. You carry a title, but no purpose has yet been revealed. And here's what's astonishing. Esther doesn't run. She stays. She listens. She waits. She doesn't abandon the process just because the spotlight dims. She doesn't assume that silence means insignificance. Why? Because the ones God uses publicly are the ones He shapes privately. And the space between the anointing and the assignment is never empty. It's sacred. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, while Esther wore silk robes and walked through marble halls, another story was unfolding beyond her sight. Mordecai, her guardian and cousin, was at the king's gate, a quiet figure watching, listening, praying, still loyal to the God whose name hadn't been spoken in Esther's palace, still standing for the people who lived under the shadow of exile. And then came the rise of Haman, a descendant of Agag, the ancient enemy of Israel, elevated by Xerxes to a position second only to the king. He wore the ring of authority. He commanded respect. He demanded worship. And Mordecai would not bow. Why? Because some convictions are too holy to compromise. Some acts of obedience don't come with applause. They come with retaliation. When Haman saw Mordecai's defiance, he didn't just burn with anger. He strategized revenge. And not just against Mordecai, but against all of his people. Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom. Esther 3 verse 6. Let that sit. While Esther dressed for royal dinners, while the city carried on with its noise and normalcy, a decree of genocide was being written. The Persian Empire was vast, 127 provinces from India to Kush, and every one of them would soon be ordered to rise up and annihilate the Jewish people. It wasn't just a plan. It was law. Signed, sealed, stamped with the king's signet ring. Set for the 13th day of the 12th month. A future date on the calendar. A countdown to destruction. And still, Esther did not know. Because the silence of God is not always about your personal story. Sometimes, it's what's happening around you that will call you into purpose. But He prepares you before you see the threat. Mordecai's grief and Esther's distance. The moment the decree was read aloud in the city of Susa, everything changed. Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the public square, crying loudly and bitterly. And he wasn't alone. All across the empire, Jews began to mourn, fasting, weeping, pleading. But Esther was insulated. She heard about Mordecai's grief, but she didn't yet know why. She sent him clothes, tried to cover his mourning, still distant from the pain, still unaware of the decree. It took a message from Mordecai to open her eyes. He sent word through Hathach, a trusted attendant. He told her of the law, the plan, the bribe Haman had paid to secure it. He even gave her a copy of the written decree. And then came the challenge. Go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for your people. Esther 4 verse 8. Here it was. The moment her silence would no longer be a safety. The moment her waiting would be exposed as preparation. The moment obedience would mean more than staying in position. It would mean risking everything. And Esther hesitated. Any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned is to be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter. And I have not been summoned for 30 days. Esther 4 verse 11. She hadn't seen him in a month. She didn't know if she still held favor. She didn't know if this was her moment or her death sentence. Because obedience always feels romantic until it costs you something. The wisdom in the waiting. We often read this part of Esther's story as if it happened overnight, but it didn't. God let her sit in silence for years. He let her carry a crown with no clarity. He let her grow in position, influence, and strategy before ever showing her the threat. Because here's the truth. If God had revealed the genocide too early, she would have been too insecure to act. If he had exposed Haman's plot when she was newly crowned, she might have panicked or retreated. But by the time the decree came, she had influence. She had access. She had favor. She had authority in rooms where decisions were made. That's the beauty of divine timing. God is not slow. He's strategic. He puts his people in place before the plan of the enemy unfolds. He aligns moments, arranges roles, hides his agents in plain sight, so that when evil shows its hand, heaven is already ahead of it. Esther's silence wasn't passive. It was preparation. And maybe yours is too, if you're living in the in-between. This part of the story is for anyone waiting on God to speak. Anyone wondering why the door opened but no direction followed. Anyone who has the position, the access, the skill, but no clarity. You are not forgotten. You are not stuck. You are being formed in quiet. Because when the move of God comes, it doesn't always announce itself with lightning. Sometimes it shows up as a broken message from a friend. A moment where injustice knocks at your gate. A whisper that says, "Now, it's time." And if you've been faithful in the waiting, you will have the wisdom for the war. So don't despise the silence. God's silence doesn't mean he's absent. It means he's preparing something only you can carry, at a time only he can choose. Share this with someone living between the door that opened and the word that hasn't come. And if you've been waiting, trusting, and staying planted, write this below. Even in the silence, I am still in his strategy. The decree of death, when evil feels unstoppable. What do you do when evil isn't just present? It's legal. When injustice has been signed into law, sealed with power, and backed by an empire. When the enemy no longer hides in the shadows but stands in broad daylight, confident that he cannot be stopped. This is not just the backdrop of Esther's story. It is the moment where everything sacred was threatened by the unchecked rise of hatred. And it began with a man named Haman, a man fueled by ego. The king had promoted him, not for valor, not for wisdom, not for loyalty, but for reasons hidden to everyone but Xerxes himself. Haman was a man of position but not of character. And the moment he received his advancement, he wanted more than recognition. He wanted reverence. By royal decree, all officials at the king's gate were commanded to kneel and pay honor to Haman. And they did, every one of them. Except one, Mordecai. Day after day, palace guards and servants bowed low at Haman's passing. But Mordecai remained upright, his back unbent, his eyes steady. At first, the officials thought it was a mistake. They approached him privately. "Why do you disobey the king's command?" But Mordecai said nothing, until eventually he gave them an answer. "Because I am a Jew." That was all. No protests. No debates, just identity. And it was enough. Haman was told. And from that moment, Haman's ego collapsed into rage. But not the kind of rage that ends in a personal vendetta. No, this was generational, historic, spiritual. Haman didn't just want Mordecai dead. He wanted every Jew in the empire wiped out. An ancient hatred reawakened. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag. And if you trace history back, the Amalekites were among Israel's oldest and most bitter enemies. It was the Amalekites who had ambushed the Israelites when they were weary and wandering in the desert after escaping Egypt. And God had declared that he would be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Saul, the first king of Israel, had been instructed to destroy Agag and his people. But he disobeyed. He spared Agag. And that act of incomplete obedience allowed the bloodline of Amalek to survive. Now, in the Persian Empire, the spiritual war that had never been resolved returned, this time dressed in politics, prestige, and policy. It was more than Mordecai's defiance. It was a holy people standing in the way of a generational hatred. And so Haman moved. But he didn't act out of impulse. He calculated, planned, delayed. He cast lots, called pur in the Persian language, to choose a date. The result? The 13th day of the 12th month. 11 months away. Why wait that long? Because evil often moves with patience. The enemy doesn't just destroy. He builds systems of destruction. And in that long stretch of time between the decree and the date, fear would spread like poison. The price of genocide. Haman approached the king. He didn't mention the Jews by name. He only described them with vague, ominous words. There is a certain people, dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different. They do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Esther 3 verse 8. Then came the bribe. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury. That was an astronomical sum, roughly 375 tons of silver. Why so much? Because hatred is expensive. Because genocide isn't just about vengeance. It's about erasing a people, their stories, their covenant, their future. And Xerxes, in a moment that would echo through history, took off his signet ring, his seal of power, and gave it to Haman. Keep the money. Do with the people as you please. And just like that, death became law. The power of a written decree. The scribes were summoned. On the 13th day of the first month, ironically, the day before Passover, the festival celebrating Israel's freedom from slavery, this new decree was written. It was translated into every language of the empire, sealed with the king's ring, dispatched to every province, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, and to plunder their goods. Esther 3 verse 13. It was chilling. Legalized extermination. A coordinated slaughter. And then, as the couriers rode off, as copies were read in public squares, as fear gripped the hearts of the innocent, the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was bewildered. Esther 3 verse 15. 2 men drank in royal comfort, while thousands of Jewish families wept in silence, while the city tried to understand the horror that had just been signed into law. What does it mean when evil seems to win? This is the part of the story where people begin to question God. Where is He? How can He allow this? Why do the wicked prosper? Why does injustice get stamped with power and delivered by horsemen? Why does it feel like those who hate truth are always one step ahead? And here's the hard truth. God often allows evil to look unstoppable before He reverses it. Not because He's late. Not because He's weak. But because what He's preparing to do will expose every layer of the enemy's plan and redeem every inch of His people's pain. It would have been easy for God to strike down Haman with disease or disaster. But instead He allowed Haman to rise so high that his fall would shake the empire. He allowed the enemy to build the gallows so that justice would be seen by all. He allowed the silence so that the voice of deliverance would be unmistakably divine. And while the Jewish people grieved, fasted, and feared, He had already positioned a queen inside the palace. He had already placed a scroll with Mordecai's name in the royal record. He had already decided how this would end. When you feel surrounded by unrighteous power, maybe you've lived in a moment like this, where evil has been legalized, where people in power speak deceit without consequence, where darkness is not whispered in corners, it's celebrated in the open. Maybe you felt like the faithful are always one signature away from destruction. But hear this, the enemy's access is never greater than God's sovereignty. No matter what decree is written, no matter what system is designed, no matter what day is circled on the calendar, God already knows the end. He is never unaware, never outmaneuvered, never too late. The decree of death may have been stamped, but the deliverance of heaven was already in motion. So don't despair when evil feels loud. Don't collapse when hatred finds a microphone. Don't retreat when lies are celebrated as law. Because God never panics. He plans. And while evil plots, heaven prepares. Share this with someone who feels overwhelmed by what's happening in the world around them. And if you've ever stared at a decree you couldn't stop, but chose to trust God anyway, write this below. What man signs in hatred, God reverses with power. If I perish, I perish. The fast that shook a kingdom. What happens when the cost of silence becomes greater than the fear of speaking up? What do you do when obedience doesn't lead to applause or safety, but could actually cost you your life? There are moments in every story where the stakes shift, where the character must choose, remain in comfort or risk everything for what's right. Esther had reached that moment. She had ascended the throne. She had gained the trust of the king. She had been favored, preserved, hidden. But now, the very people she came from, her blood, her history, her nation, were under a death sentence. And no crown, no beauty, no influence would protect her from what she was about to face. The message that shattered the illusion. The day Mordecai's message reached Esther, her entire world collapsed inwards. Haman's decree had gone out. Her people were weeping in streets, tearing their garments, covering themselves with ashes. But Esther had been untouched by the urgency, insulated by the palace, shielded by layers of protocol, guards, attendants, and schedule. She sent Mordecai clothing, still unaware of the decree's horror, still believing his grief could be soothed with garments. But Mordecai refused them. He sent a message instead, a copy of the edict, a report of the silver Haman had paid, and a charge, go to the king. Beg, plead, speak. Esther's first reply came with understandable fear. All the king's officials know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the penalty is death, unless he extends the golden scepter. And I have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. Esther 4 verse 11. You can almost hear the breathlessness in her response. 30 days. An eternity in a place where attention was currency and favor could vanish overnight. She had not forgotten where she came from. She had not lost her humility. But she had become keenly aware of the danger of influence, how fragile it truly was. This was not a woman unwilling to act. This was a woman weighing the full weight of sacrifice. She had seen the empire's power up close. She had tasted both its privilege and its unpredictability. She knew the law. And she knew, if she moved too soon, too strong, or too visible, she could be erased. Mordecai's unshakable challenge. Mordecai's response pierced through the veil of palace comfort and struck Esther's spirit with holy clarity. Do not think that because you are in the king's house you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Esther 4 verses 13 to 14. It was not a threat. It was a reminder that comfort is not calling, that favor is not an end, it's a means, that God doesn't need us to deliver his people, but he invites us into the deliverance he's already planning. Mordecai wasn't begging Esther to act. He was awakening her to why she was chosen. This was the moment where identity collided with destiny. All her life, Esther had been careful, wise, discerning, silent, composed. She had obeyed. She had waited. But now she would have to speak, not with calculated diplomacy, but with costly courage. And her answer? One of the boldest declarations in Scripture. The fast that shook a kingdom. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther 4 verse 16. No angel appeared. No burning bush. No prophecy from the heavens. Just a woman. A widow of parents she never knew. A foreigner in a kingdom that feared her people. A queen whose favor hung by a thread. She said, I will go. But first she called a fast. Not a plan. Not a speech. Not a show of strength. A fast. 3 days of no food. No water. No distractions. Just prayer. Mourning. Repentance. Alignment. This was more than preparation. It was warfare. Because every move in the natural must first be settled in the spirit. And before Esther ever stepped before Xerxes, she went before God, in stillness, in surrender, in hunger. Fasting when you're frightened. Fasting is not a tactic. It's a declaration. It says, I don't move by human strategy. I move by divine strength. It says, my life is not my own. My survival is not my priority. My obedience is. Esther's fast wasn't her trying to change God's mind. It was God changing her, burning off the fear, the palace instincts, the self-preservation. This fast was the funeral of her old life. Because once she made that choice, there was no going back. No hiding. No passing. No protection in her position. She would either be remembered as a queen who saved her people, or die as a woman who dared to interrupt the king for the sake of the condemned. But she was no longer trying to control the outcome. She was ready to obey, even if she never saw the fruit of her obedience. That is what makes a person unstoppable in God's hands. When you know it's your time to stand. There is a moment in every believer's life when your Esther moment will come. It may not involve crowns or empires or ancient enemies. It may not look like danger, but it will feel like death. Death to your comfort. Death to your reputation. Death to your fear of man. You will be called to risk something, to confront something, to fast, to pray, to break the silence, to show up even when everything in you wants to stay hidden. And in that moment you will hear it. If I perish, I perish. Not in despair, but in victory. Because what you're surrendering is fear itself. This kind of courage doesn't shout. It whispers in the dark. It gets dressed in ashes. It lays down everything for the chance to see God move through the impossible. History was never the same. Esther's fast didn't just prepare her body, it postured her spirit. In those 3 days, history bent. Heaven aligned. Angels were assigned. Hearts were stirred. The courtroom of the King of Kings was filled with petition. And when she emerged from that place, 3 days hungry but filled with resolve, she wasn't just a queen. She was a weapon in the hands of God. Maybe that's where you are right now. Standing between the fear of perishing and the call to rise. Wondering if your obedience will be met with favor or fury. But Esther reminds us, you don't need to know the outcome to obey. You only need to know the voice that's calling you. And when you fast, when you surrender, when you say yes, you move the heart of God. You shake the kingdom of darkness. You realign nations, even if you don't live to see it. Share this with someone who's standing on the edge of obedience. And if you've ever said yes to God without knowing what it would cost, write this below. If I perish, but I will not be silent. The strategy of the banquet, when boldness wears elegance. Have you ever been called to speak up? but had to wait for the exact right moment to open your mouth? Have you ever carried the burden of truth so heavy that it pressed against your ribs, but you knew one wrong word, one rushed step, and everything could fall apart? This is not just boldness. This is not just obedience. This is strategy. This is where Esther steps into her God-ordained assignment. Not with rage, not with tears, not with fear, but with wisdom so sharp it sliced through the atmosphere in silence. The fast was over. Her heart had been broken, humbled, and sharpened in the furnace of surrender. Now she would walk into the fire, not hoping to avoid it, but willing to burn if it meant saving a nation. But the weapon in her hand? Not a sword, not a scroll, not a banquet. Approaching the throne. 3 days of no food or water had passed. Esther had fasted. Her attendants had fasted. Her people across Susa had wept, mourned, and pleaded with heaven. But now she had to move. And with trembling hands she clothed herself, not in her pain, not in her fear, but in her royal garments. She dressed for the moment. The very same beauty that once seemed a distraction now became a divine instrument. She wasn't walking into the king's court to beg. She was walking in as queen. But make no mistake, her life still hung in the balance. The law was clear. Anyone who approached the king without invitation could be executed on the spot, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther took that risk. Step by step, she crossed the threshold into the inner court of the king. The same throne room where others had died for lesser offenses. Servants froze. Attendants went silent. And there she stood, unveiled. See? And then, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. Esther 5 verse 2. Grace opened the door. Favor had not forgotten her. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." And in that moment the room leaned forward. Because this was it. The time to plead. To cry. To unveil the plot. But she didn't. Instead she said something unexpected. "If it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." A banquet? A woman whose people are facing genocide. A queen risking her life for an audience. And her first move is an invitation to dinner? This was not delay. This was divine strategy. Why didn't she expose Haman immediately? Some might think she lost her nerve. Others might assume indecision. But what if God had whispered, "Not yet"? What if her spirit, still sharpened by the fast, discerned something deeper? She wasn't here to react. She was here to outmaneuver darkness with discernment. The enemy's strength was pride, so she would let him walk straight into his own downfall. She understood what many still struggle to grasp. Deliverance is not always loud. Sometimes it's slow, calculated, cloaked in silence and served with wine. So the king and Haman came to the banquet. And again the king asked, "Now what is your request? Ask anything up to half the kingdom." And again, she didn't ask for her life. Instead, "If the king regards me with favor, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Esther 5 verse 8. She waited. Because sometimes victory depends not just on what you say, but when you say it. Meanwhile, Haman builds the gallows. After the first banquet, Haman was elated. He had been invited to dine, not just with royalty but as the only guest. He walked out puffed up, pride swelling in his chest, position poisoning his mind. But as he passed through the king's gate, there stood Mordecai, still refusing to bow, still unmoved by Haman's growing fame. And Haman's pride turned to venom. He rushed home, gathered his wife and friends, and recounted his glory. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to the banquet, But none of this gives me satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Esther 5 verse 13. His wife and friends, caught in the fever of his ego, offered a suggestion. Have a pole set up 75 feet high, and ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. And Haman, pleased by this counsel, gave the order. Even as Esther prepared her second banquet, even as the king rested in comfort, a gallows was being built, a 75-foot-high monument of malice. But Haman didn't know, the banquet he was heading to wasn't his honor. It was his unraveling. The strategy behind Esther's silence. Esther's story is often seen as a miracle of courage. But in truth, it is equally a miracle of timing. She didn't rush. She didn't over-explain. She didn't argue or cry in front of the king. She created space. A first banquet to test the temperature. To let Haman's ego marinate. To let the king's curiosity grow. To let divine tension build in the background. A second banquet to unleash the full force of truth. At the exact moment when heaven had aligned every detail. Sometimes we fail not because we didn't act, but because we acted too soon. Esther teaches us that deliverance requires not just obedience, but precision. Elegance is not weakness, it's wisdom in robes. There is something breathtaking about how Esther moves in this chapter. She doesn't storm the palace gates. She doesn't shout down injustice in the throne room. She dresses in royal robes. She prepares wine and food. She speaks with honor. And yet, through that grace, she is overturning genocide. She is dismantling an ancient spiritual enemy with the subtlety of a whispered invitation. This is not weakness. This is power. It is boldness wrapped in gentleness. It is warfare done with a servant's towel. It is the wisdom of God disarming the rage of hell, one meal at a time. When your battle requires patience, maybe you fasted, you've prayed, you've stood in courage, but now you're being asked to wait, to discern, to trust God's timing. You want to confront, you want to fix, you want to shout the truth from the rooftop. But God is saying, wait for the second banquet. He's building something in the unseen. The enemy's gallows are rising, not to destroy you but to expose him. The tables are being prepared, not to celebrate your enemy, but to dismantle him in front of you. And your obedience today may seem small, but it's setting up the moment where everything will be turned upside down. So be still. Be wise. Move with strategy. Speak with discernment. Trust the hand of the one who has already written the end. The banquet that will rewrite the story. At the close of that first night, Haman walked home with pride in his heart and murder in his hands. Esther returned to her chambers, silent but steady. The king lay in bed, unaware of the sleepless night ahead. But heaven was alert. God was already aligning one of the most dramatic reversals in Scripture. And at the heart of it was a woman who knew. Boldness doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it sets a table. Share this with someone who's being asked to wait before they speak. And if you've ever trusted God enough to hold your tongue and let Him reveal the right moment, write this below. I will wait for the second banquet. God's timing is perfect. Gallows and reversals. When the plot turns back on the enemy. What if I told you that the enemy's loudest moment is often the beginning of his downfall? That just when wickedness seems most secure, when evil walks through palaces with power, when it looks like all hope is gone, God does something quietly behind the curtain of the world and turns everything around. We live in a world that celebrates force. We think victory requires dominance. But the God of Esther works in reversals. Not chaos. Precision. Not explosions. Timing. Not thrones and horses. Sleepless nights and forgotten scrolls. This is the part of the story where God shows us just how strategic heaven can be. Because while Haman built a gallows to kill the man of God, God was preparing a reversal so poetic, so unexpected, it could only have been written by heaven itself. A sleepless king and a scroll no one asked for. The night after Esther's first banquet should have been quiet. No conflict. No speech. Just waiting. But something strange happened. That night the king could not sleep. Esther 6 verse 1. Not because of a nightmare. Not because of guilt. Not because of noise in the courtyard. He just couldn't sleep. He tossed, turned, laid in silence under silk covers. But peace would not come. Why? Because when God wants to shift a nation, he can wake a king without a whisper. God needed Xerxes restless. Not to show him a vision, but to make him reach for a scroll. So he gave an order to bring the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, and read it to him. Esther 6 verse 1. Thousands of entries. Years of political records. A sea of forgotten stories. But the one that was read to him? A moment that had happened years ago. A minor event almost forgotten in time. Mordecai had once uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. 2 palace guards. A whisper. A report through Esther. Lives saved. But nothing had ever been done about it. Xerxes sat up. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Esther 6 verse 3. The attendants answered, nothing has been done. Pause there. Nothing had been done. Not because Mordecai was unworthy, but because God had delayed the reward for this very night. If Mordecai had been honored when it happened, this story would have unfolded differently. But heaven had preserved his reward, not forgotten it, stored it, timed it, and now it was ready. Haman's morning march into humiliation. As the king was awakening to the value of Mordecai, someone else was stirring with murderous intent. Haman. The gallows were finished, towering high above the homes of Susa. An obscene structure meant to elevate Mordecai's death, literally and symbolically. And early that morning Haman entered the palace. Smug. Ready. He would request Mordecai's execution, get the king's signature and finish the story. But God had reversed the script. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up. Esther 6 verse 4. Before Haman could say a word, Xerxes asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Esther 6 verse 6. Haman's heart swelled. Who would the king want to honor more than me? So he painted the fantasy he had long nursed in his mind. Let the man wear a royal robe the king has worn, ride a horse the king has ridden. Let him be led through the city square by one of the king's most noble princes, shouting, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Xerxes smiled. Excellent. Go at once. Do everything you've said, for Mordecai the Jew. Imagine the silence that followed. Haman's lips froze. His face burned. His pride crumbled. And the very man he came to kill, he was now commanded to honor publicly. Not just with words but with hands. He would lead Mordecai on horseback through the streets, announcing his greatness. God hadn't just blocked Haman's plan. He humiliated him with the same voice he tried to weaponize. The reversal begins. What kind of God makes your enemy prepare your parade? What kind of wisdom turns an execution platform into a platform of shame for the wicked? Only the God of reversals. He raises the poor from the dust, and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes. Psalm 113 verses 7 to 8. Mordecai, once invisible at the king's gate, was now exalted before the city. Haman, once the king's favorite, returned home mourning and covering his head. He rushed into his house, humiliated. But this time something had shifted in the atmosphere. His wife and advisors, who had once encouraged him to build the gallows, now changed their tune. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Esther 6 verse 13. It was a prophecy disguised as a warning, because they recognized something now Haman didn't see. This battle wasn't political anymore. It was spiritual. And God had begun to fight. Why God lets the enemy build first? Have you ever wondered why God seems to delay? Why he lets the gallows go up? Why the decree gets signed? Why the wicked prosper long enough to taste power? Because when he reverses it, no one can take the credit but him. No manipulation. No coincidence. No politics. Only God. When Mordecai was exalted and Haman was humiliated, Esther had not yet even revealed her request. The second banquet hadn't happened, but heaven had already begun to pull the rug out from under evil. What to remember in your own story. Maybe today you're watching wickedness rise. Maybe you see injustice celebrated. Maybe you know someone is plotting against your name, your calling, your family. And like Esther, you fasted. Like Mordecai, you stood upright. Like the Jews of Susa, you've wept and waited. But you don't see the change yet. Hear this, God never forgets the good you did when no one noticed. He writes it down. He stores it. And at the appointed hour, he will call your name out of the scroll. And the very enemy who tried to destroy you will have to honor you. Because the God of Mordecai is still in charge. The gallows are not for you. That thing your enemy built, that lie they crafted, that plan they whispered, that trap they set, it's going to collapse under the weight of their own pride. And when the reversal begins, it will be so thorough, so precise, so unexpected, that even the spectators will have to say, surely this was the hand of God. So hold your position. Stay faithful at the gate. Don't move to defend yourself. Let God author the reversal. The gallows are not your grave. They are your evidence that what the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for good. Share this with someone who feels surrounded by schemes. And if you've ever trusted God to reverse what looked final, write this below. Even if the enemy is building, even if fear has paralyzed a generation, God is still raising voices. And yours may be next. So if you've ever fasted in silence, waited in the hallway of purpose, stood alone before an earthly king, or trusted God in the quiet, know this, the same God who moved in Esther's silence is still moving in yours. You may not see him, but he is scripting the reversal. He is remembering the scroll. He is preparing your second banquet. And when the moment comes, when you speak, when you stand, when you obey, generations will remember that God still saves. Share this entire series with someone walking through a quiet battle. And if this story awakens something in you, write this below. Even in silence, I trust the hidden hand of God. This may be the end of Esther's scroll. But for you, this is only the beginning.